Our final speaker for this morning is Bev Abma. Bev is a long-term overseas development worker who has worked with CRWRC, which is now World Renew. She has also been involved in founding the Foods Resource Bank and is currently on their board. She also led their overseas food security program in the past and often would come to ECHO with visitors to learn more about food security issues. And it was always a pleasure, as ECHO staff have told me in the past, to have Bev come and visit with the people to learn more. Bev recently completed a graduate impact study for the Asian Rural Institute, ARI. And I actually ran into her at Calvin College at a conference, and that was my first time to actually meet Bev. But I must say, throughout my short career in international development, as I would walk around, meet new people, meet people that I considered mentors, leaders in the field, they would often ask me, "Do you know Bev?" And I always felt a little jealous that I didn't know I hadn't met her yet. And so it was a pleasure as I was walking the halls in Calvin, and she was standing at a booth, and we started talking and connected, and I learned more about the study that she had just recently done for ARI. She is now on their board, the American Friends of ARI, and she has people around the world that respect her and have seen the work that she has done and how she has helped educate people on various issues involved in international development. And Bev, it's just a pleasure to have you here. I know there's so many people that would have loved to be here with you today, and there may be some in the room, but I know there's many more who are cheering you on and happy to knowing that you're here at ECHO today. So can you guys give Bev a round of warm applause?
Thank you. Well, it's very humbling and almost embarrassing, all those kind words. But I am so deeply grateful for a long and meaningful relationship here with ECHO. Not only for myself, but for the many people that I've been able to introduce to ECHO here, as well as in 2 of your regional centers over the years. And I'm deeply humbled once again by the way God puts pieces together so that much of what I will share will resonate with things you've already heard this week. And for me, that's always evidence of God planning this conference. My background is very different from most of your speakers in that my university has really been on the ground at the foot of people in villages. At the feet of people like the woman I met in Uganda 20 years ago. All day long, I was traveling with colleagues from a local organization who said, "We have to meet this old woman today. We have to make sure we stop to visit this old woman." And finally, I said, "Well, how old is this old woman?" Well, she was 2 years younger than I was. That was 20 years ago, so you know that I've been an old woman for a very long time. God also humbled me by teaching me that everything in my life was preparation for the things he still had in store for me to do. My husband died in a car accident in Senegal 22 years ago. And after that, in new situations, I hated to say that I was a widow because everybody would feel sorry for me. So I wouldn't say it. However, one day in Malawi, a community was preparing to distribute the corn that people had brought to pay forward after a program where they had gotten seeds. And so they invited us to sit down, and we were waiting as the rats were being evacuated from the storage shed. And I saw a group of women sitting alone a ways away, and nobody was talking to them. And finally I asked, "Who are they?" And someone said, "Oh, those are the widows." Well, I don't know, but in that moment, I had to get up and sit with those women. And immediately the director of the organization came over and said, "Bev, what are you doing?" And I said, "Well, these are the widows I guess that's where I belong. Saying that and the conversation that followed with those women was something that I will never forget. The hope and the energy that it brought to them was something that reminded me that God made me a widow for a reason. Now, I've worked in community development for more than 35 years with numerous organizations, and I'm not going to refer to them specifically here, but you can ask more about them in the Meet the Speaker session this afternoon. And as most development workers, especially those of us motivated by our faith, I have a strong desire to help others, especially the poor. But I've often had to ask myself, have I really contributed to making a difference? What would I see if I go back to a community 10 years later? Will I notice any change? And retirement has given me a really unique opportunity to go deeper in an authentic way. With the legitimacy that's been established through long years of relationships with people, I come as an old friend. I don't come with money, but I come with love and concern. And as one person who asked to see me the first time I came to a country after I retired, he said to me, well, now I can tell you the real story. And I think that's true. And today I want to share some of what I've learned in the going back and listening. And I'm thinking about how can we measure the difference? And for me, that is looking at transformation that is positive and sustainable over the long term. When I think about the word transformation, probably the first time I really heard a root of that word was when my son was a child and played with those things called transformers. You know, one day it was a man, and the next day it was a car, and next day it'd be a man again, whatever his whim was. And when I think of transformation, I have seen a lot of negative transformation in the world. I think of young people who get drawn into street gangs because they want to belong to community, or the ever-increasing number of child soldiers around the world. So for me, it's extremely important that the change has been positive. Also, sustainable. Is it something that can continue without the people and resources when I leave? And is it long-term? How long do those changes last? And all of these concepts need to go together, I think, for our helping to truly be healing and not just Band-Aid solutions. But back to the beginning. The early 80s took me to the Dominican Republic, where mothers of the most malnourished children were gathered 5 days a week and served cornmeal that was part of the Public Law 480 food being shipped to the Dominican Republic. It had been going on there for 20 years. The mothers prepared breakfast and lunch, and once a week they got some nutrition training, and the children were weighed. But one of the saddest days of my life was meeting a young woman who was ready to wean her child. And I said to her, what are you going to be feeding your child? And she said, oh, I'm going to do like my mother did when I was a baby. I'll just come to the center every day. And I was hired to help people get out of that dependency. No easy task. As you all know, change is difficult, but in this situation was extremely so. Some communities started to grow onions and peppers, especially after they were unable to repay their loans, their input loans that had been offered by a tobacco company, and the crop failed. Other communities totally refused to work with us, saying, you know, you don't want to come and give us food, but there's so many people in the US that would just love to do that. And sadly to say, that is still true today. But the image of that mother and child haunted me for years after I left the country, as I wondered whether I'd been a part of any impact at all. Then, 20 years later, I had the chance to go back to an area that I had worked in. And there I saw prolific fields of oregano, passion fruit, and a variety of vegetables. And not only seeing that blossom, but seeing the energy and the hope in people's steps and their voices was just amazing. When I asked what had made the changes in their lives, they talked about having learned some hard lessons. In the year or two before that, an international organization had come in with plastic greenhouses, and everybody thought this was going to be so wonderful. However, plastic in that hot, humid climate just meant that everything rotted and molded. And so the greenhouses were abandoned, and they had returned to the things that we had taught them. They'd gone back to those lessons of depending on themselves, developing their own vision, and they were now growing both food and cash crops and using the proceeds to educate and provide better health for their children. It was kind of a humbling fact to realize that one of the biggest contributors to change was probably not so much what I said, but the fact that my 5-year-old daughter loved to be in the communities. The fact that she would ask permission to eat the grapefruit that was rotting on the ground because people wouldn't give it to their girls because it was believed that citrus fruit made girls sick. And so you could go into a village and you could pick out the girls by the color of their hair, like the little ones on the right there, while the boys looked healthy. But not all beliefs were bad ones. Some of them were good and needed to be reinforced, like the one that women should eat salted fish for 40 days after you have a baby. Now, I'm not sure where your mind goes when you hear me say that, but in this context, it was a really good practice, because the salt would make the mothers drink more, and so that would increase their breast milk. And the fish was probably the best source of protein that they were going to have, because the way the food order went in that family was that Dad got whatever of the chicken he wanted because he was the one who did the physical work, and then on down through the kids, and maybe Mom might get the chicken foot. Then, in the 1980s, I was heading community development in Africa when the rage of the day was women in development, and all efforts were going towards helping women. And soap making was the big one that was being promoted. Now, the first few women in a village would be so excited about their income that they were making on soap making, but that soon vanished when everybody else started making soap, and there's only so many times you can bath in a day. How sad it was, too, then, to see the women in Malawi who'd been taught vegetable gardening, and treadle pumps had been introduced to help them increase their production. And for a season, they did really well, selling their vegetables that they were able to do with the water, until their husbands, who had more access to money, decided that maybe they should get into gardening and could afford the electric pumps that were less labor-intensive, and so outdid their own wives in vegetable production. So it really created a competition rather than looking at the well-being of the whole family. And then there was the challenge of the war in Sierra Leone. Rebels came through the villages and they ate people's food rice. So people started eating their seed rice. Now that was a particular variety of upland rice that if we lost it, where were we going to get new seed for people to grow? And so we had calculated about $10,000 would allow us to buy the available seed rice from the farmers. They'd then have money to buy food, and we could sell it back at cost the following season. But it was a time in my organization of budget cuts. In fact, $100,000 had just come out of my West Africa budget. So I was told, well, the only thing we can do, if you can figure out a way for a shipping container of canola oil from Canada to save your seed rice, you can have it. Well, sometimes I get a little determined, as did another woman that was with me, and we thought we're going to make this work. World Food Program was running a refugee camp, so we swapped a container of rice from them immediately for a container of canola oil that would arrive in about 6 weeks. Then we had to transport it up through unsafe areas to the farmers. Well, we did it and it worked. But if you really think about it, it was an extremely inefficient, risky way to do things and really cost a whole lot more than $10,000. And it's an example of how relief interventions are still the most common and popular way of helping in especially North American culture. Why? It's because they are immediate and urgent, and there's genuine suffering. And the media coverage is extensive and most often focused on the severest suffering that sometimes pulls out the guilt of people and the compassion. And so the larger the media intervention, the greater the donations. And that there can be a huge outpouring of goods, services, and money. And in the 5 years that I worked in domestic disaster response, I quickly learned that I was going to label the funds for money to come into more generically. Because if we just said summer storms instead of the Wichita tornado, we would have money available that had poured in for a big publicized event to use in ones that the media didn't pick up because there was something else that was a hotter issue to report on that day. Relief has become an industry of its own. Food commodities are sitting out in the ocean waiting markets. People need to spend money before the end of fiscal years, and often they're looking for tax write-offs, and so you find unnecessary goods being distributed at times. I remember attending a meeting at the White House after Hurricane Mitch with donors wanting to contribute to the response, and there were the chicken producers that wanted to ship 2 containers of frozen chicken to Honduras. I asked the question about, I don't think the port in San Pedro Sula is even open. How are you going to keep this chicken? And even if you get it there, there's no electricity. Well, I don't think I've ever heard as much political dancing as there was around that question, and no one ever said, don't send the chicken. And as a result, I expect that those 2 containers of chicken were part of the 1,200 containers that arrived at the port and they couldn't handle them. And they were really the disaster after the disaster. Corruption is huge because of the immediacy and the urgency. People often don't go through the same criteria of hiring and monitoring the situation. And in fact, one well-known organization, a staff person said to me, well, you know, we just consider that 30% slippage is what to expect in a disaster. Relief activities are often too much and too long. Really, if you wanted them to be effective, they'd need to be airlifted in to be there when the need arises. They often come too late. And in addition, I think of the millions of suitcases with used goods coming from North America that head all over the world in situations that aren't even emergency situations. As a result, I've seen tailors lose their jobs. I've seen the textile industry in Kenya faltering. And I've seen farmers in Ethiopia watching the grain dripping out of the trucks that are bringing in food aid while their own crops there's no market for. Goods often come with donor requirements, such as that for democracy, which doesn't always work. Moyo, in her book Dead Aid, explains that it makes little difference to a hungry people if they can vote or not, and that aid is one of the greatest assets to corruption and often actually reinforces the cycles of poverty. I have a Ugandan friend who puts it even more bluntly. He said, Bev, relief has made us lazy. Women are especially vulnerable. I've heard stories from women far too often of how they are not given their relief allotments until they offer sexual favors to the men in charge. Many relief efforts are faith-based, but provide them only to the household of faith or require church attendance for someone to get aid. By contrast, I want to talk about 2 interventions that I saw, one in Mozambique and one in Malawi, where Christian development organizations used the capacity of people they had trained to be the ones to do the needs assessment surveys in the communities. And they identified who were the people with need, whether they were Christians or not. And the people in need were included, and Christians who did not have needs were excluded along with everyone else. After those interventions, the church flourished, and the organizations had more requests for help to communities because their integrity was valued. I think that was a far greater Christian witness that I saw in those instances. You know, development is what we're really here to talk about, was an idea that emerged after World War II. If Europe and Japan could be rebuilt, then maybe something could be done about some of those other poorer countries in the world. But you need to know the idea wasn't totally altruistic, but it was also partly, if we get in there and help, maybe they'll be less drawn to some of the Soviet influence. And the goal became one of modernization or westernization, whichever term fits better for you, and became measured by the size of a country's economy. There were 3 international institutions set up: the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. The goal was to decrease the percentage of people living below the poverty line, and the new measurement was created, the gross domestic product, often referred to as the GDP. It was a politically managed system of market reforms that was developed with open markets and exchange rates determined by the global market. Countries needed to be open for foreign investment, they needed to privatize their state-run industries, and reduce their public sector spending. This was disaster for the poor because it decreased their already low-waged, and it decreased health services, both in terms of workers and medicine, and introduced school fees, something that we don't pay here in the West. You're probably all familiar with Jeffrey Sachs' assertion that poverty eradication is the moral responsibility of the development world, and enough money and technology will fix it. Well, most say the jury is still out on that one. People-centered theories come from those working on the front lines with the poor, saying it's not what people consume, but what they are able to do and choose to do that really makes a difference. We've heard this week about Robert Chambers' contributions toward participatory approaches. Easterly sees top-down interventions really as colonial holdovers and sees social problems as best solved as close to the action as possible, and usually by trial and error and trying again. Collier sees the bottom billion having additional problems of poverty with the 4 poverty traps. There's chronic conflict, the negative impact of abundant natural resources. Certainly saw this in the war in Sierra Leone with diamonds just coming out of there without any sort of control. Bad governance, and countries that are landlocked with bad neighbors. Capital. Eunice is well known for his work with microcredit, and small loans do promote the entrepreneurial spirit of individuals. And you find a lot of poor people with wonderful entrepreneurial skills. A woman that I met in Zambia got tired of the fighting over the one plug in the restaurant for people to recharge their cell phones. So she started a cell phone charging station and very quickly had a really good income. Now you see those popping up all over, run on solar power. M-Pesa in Kenya, mobile transfer of money, allows people to send money without having to travel long distances. I asked a young man one day what it meant to family relationships, that he no longer visited his mother as often because he could just send her money. And he said, oh, actually, it's even better because I can talk to her now every day. Then you have the servant leader model that is the biblical model of that's Christ washing his disciples' feet of serving. And I've seen this best emulated at the Asian Rural Institute in Japan, who brings participants from all different countries. When I was interviewing the graduates after they went home, I said, what does servant leadership mean to you? And I didn't document the number of times the first response out of someone's mouth was, well, I never understood what it meant until I saw the director cleaning the toilet. And it is sort of standard practice at the Asian Rural Institute that the director cleans the toilets every morning. But Bryant Myers, in his latest book, Engaging Globalization, asked the question, where are the Christians? And he cites the general population as being different than those of us here in this room today, saying their responses are often micro and local and focus only on neighbors they know. I'm personally involved in a church that has recently been invited to a church-to-church partnership with a church in Kenya. And the conversations are deep and challenging as they ask us about our stance on homosexuality and women in leadership. The questions are coming from people in a very remote area whose pastor has challenged them. How can we have a relationship with a church in another country if we don't even know how to relate to the churches in our own community? As a result, there are 7 churches of different denominations in that general area that exchange pulpits regularly and work together on a lot of community initiatives. And our church is learning that we're called, as the call in Acts, to Jerusalem, Samaria, and the uttermost parts of the world, as we see the benefit of both local, regional, and global relationships. There are some products that have come in development over the years. One of them is infrastructure. And just this year, I went back to Kenya, and it had only been a year since I had been there the last time, and the changes were just amazing. The railroad system that's being constructed. I was able to take the train from Nairobi to Mombasa, didn't have to worry about all that traffic on the death road where all the goods are transported through to Uganda. And to just see how much the train was expanding from when I'd been there before. China is doing that. And some observe that China is so successful in spreading infrastructure in Africa because it tends to focus on giving money and rather than doing it through the barrel of a gun. However, thinking of the railroad in Kenya, they will hand it over, the Chinese will govern it for 10 years and then hand it over to the Kenya government. On my skeptical days, I kind of wonder whether that's about the lifespan of that railroad and it'll be seen as the Kenyans letting it go down. Kenya Airways recently started flying from Nairobi to New York, and I recently heard this little tongue-in-cheek thing about, well, we can fly people across the ocean, but we're not trusted to transport them across our own country. And I went online last night to get the direct quote on that and discovered that after 2 weeks of operating, Kenya Airways has suspended their flights. They said it was due to low demand. Another aspect that we see happening a lot in development is donor bias to project funding that has really been troubling to me in recent years. And why? When you fund a short-term project, staff gain skills when they're working on something. And so often they lose their job at the end of the project when the money ends. And if there's a gap before a new project is approved, maybe they go on to a different job, and that leaves the organization looking for new staff again. And it also leaves little incentive for people to really be creative and do their best in their job because they know it's so short-lived. And so it's easy to look at, what can I get out of this job so I can support my family at the end, rather than what can I put into it. Donors often have a lot of unrealistic expectations when we do project funding. I have talked to people, especially one young man in Manipur, who said, I'm expected to give reports on crop yields this month, but we don't harvest until next month. What do? Do I lie so that I have the money for my community? He said, I just don't know how to handle this. When someone leaves for training, such as the 9-month program that I talked about in Japan, the organization has really wonderful intentions of wanting them to come back to maybe start some kind of a agricultural project. However, their donor has changed their decision of what they want to fund. So the person may come back to find they don't have a job, or they have to change to work in a totally different direction. I think those of us who've been in development for a while can certainly remember the changes from agriculture to business to medications when HIV was first described. And then when we discovered that people couldn't tolerate the medications without food, then the focus went back to agriculture. Then a lot of commercialization. And it's kind of like the flavor of the month at the ice cream store. Sen is a person who said we need to measure not through GDP, but he added another dimension called a Human Development Index, or the HDI. And that uses life expectancy as a health indicator and literacy for knowledge and education. Health interventions like immunizations were developed in the West, expensive, a lot of research, and funding. But then that transfer of that technology is affordable and available in other countries. But accepting it is often difficult because of the distrust of history. The history of the slave trade and how Ugandans felt that Westerners maybe didn't want them to prosper resulted in really nothing being able to be done with AIDS medications there for a long time because of that distrust. And even today, the Maasai see the Kenyan government legislation to ban female genital circumcision, which happens to be some of the most radical in the world, as a way of the world wanting to eliminate their culture. So instead of protecting girls, the legislation has actually resulted in more people clandestinely doing the procedure before anybody suspects they might want to do it. It takes people who are from the culture, like my friend Anne, a Maasai woman, who is so passionate about not only protecting the girls, but helping families look at positive rites of passage that they can celebrate womanhood. The little picture in the corner is of disposable sanitary supplies that help girls to stay in school for a whole month instead of missing out the 4 days of their menstrual cycle. And that's so important because it's well established that a girl's level of education is what is the best indicator of how she will care for her children. But sometimes I feel kind of sad that I see adult literacy still done in some of the same places it was done years ago. Adult literacy, when it's just done as a literacy program, doesn't seem to make that much of a difference. But when it responds to a real need, it does. For instance, the women that I talked about in Malawi who needed to read and write, not to be taken advantage of in the market. And I think of how many people have become functionally literate to be able to text on their phone or do their M-Pesa transactions, real motivation to learning to read and write. But I really do want to celebrate some of the progress that I've seen over the years. I've seen us change from technical to holistic focuses, more use of participatory approaches, and that was so exciting to see so much talk about that here in this conference. But holistic approaches have also changed the way we measure success. In the early days of my work, where we focused on whether we were agriculturalists or literacy workers, your goals tended to be very specific. And so in agriculture, people looked at how much agricultural production had increased. But if your increased agricultural production results in a man taking on another wife, or spending it all in the bar on the weekend, is that really an indicator of success? Or we used to look at indicators for income generation. And I think of the woman in the Philippines who came to me one day and said, yeah, I just sold my eggs this morning so that the kids can go and buy candy at the Sari Sari store because we really want our group to have the best income this month. We've missed the boat when we look at things like that. But I've also seen another positive change in no longer working with the poorest of the poor, no longer the mothers of the children that you saw in my early picture in the Dominican Republic. Those aren't the mothers who are going to make change in their community. So now I see models like working with master farmers who become the trainers and educators in their community. I've seen us change from fewer external consultants to local leaders. Just evidence of that with Ed Sabio here with us from the Philippines, who'll be in charge of the Eco Research Center, where years before we would often send North Americans to do that. I have a friend, Johnny in Kenya, who is finishing up the study guide for helping without hurting in Africa. That's a study guide that will go with When Helping Hurts, but written from an African perspective. Look for that in 2019. Just recently, I watched some savings and credit organizations in Kenya respond to the largest flood of the century in their country by working with the displaced people in the camps using their development skills. Members of the savings and credit organizations were hired to do the needs assessment in the communities and help with training people on their rights within the camps. And not only were they continuing their weekly savings meetings in the camp, they did it in front of everybody so they would be able to witness how it worked, including if you see that little basket behind all the people sitting there, that's where you put your fine if you came late before you sit down in the circle. And they worked with the wider community, collaborating with government, with local, national, and international NGOs, with everyone signed a specific responsibility to participate in the camp's well-being. But I would also be remiss if I didn't admit that yesterday's successes have sometimes created new challenges for us. The efficiency and quantity of relief in great abundance has often created problems. It was here at an ECHO conference several years ago, someone shared about a local hospital in Haiti shutting down because people were going for the free aid coming in from donors. And I often wonder what happened when all of those donors went on to a disaster somewhere else. In Haiti, after 9 hours of traveling over horrible, long, bumpy roads, a distance of a couple of 100 kilometers to get to the airport, I got on the plane to hear people complaining about the rough tarmac on the new runway that had been put in the north for volunteers to bring in their supplies and their volunteers more comfortably. Somehow it seemed like dishonest for me that we're putting the money into making it comfortable for us to get there and do things rather than improving life for the Haitian people. I also think of Nias Island that had a tidal wave in 2004, and everybody came in and built infrastructure that totally destroyed the community's perspectives on helping each other, and now everybody wanting to be paid. World Food Program is making some good moves in terms of looking at local purchase. It's harder to do sometimes a local purchase in places where your roads and infrastructure are bad, but it really does honor the food sovereignty of people. I think of how often people in Africa have said to me, Americans send us animal food. They don't eat the yellow corn back there that they send us. We eat white corn here. So local purchase has really helped with honoring what is the things that people want, just the same as we would not want to eat the Malawi sausage or the caterpillars that sometimes are offered in other places. You see, I put education here, and you may think, how can education create challenges? Well, these children, the first picture I saw them when they were in 2004. The community had established its first preschool and now has developed 4 high schools. But the teachers a couple of years ago said, how can our graduates compete in the wider world if we can't teach them how to use a computer? Well, it was a wonderful way for churches in North America to look at how do we match and partner with what the community is already doing to supply laptops to the schools there. But it can even be a challenge in educating North American donors. I think we're all familiar with the books When Helping Hurts and Toxic Charity, but those have motivated some people to say, well, I'm not going to give it all. If it doesn't do any good, why should I give? Rather than looking for effective ways of giving. And it's part of that conversation that has come out with the models for the training programs on helping without hurting. You know, the agriculture aspects, interventions, we're all familiar with some of the GMOs and the patents and those kind of things that are challenges in the world. So for me, ECHO's like a wonderful oasis here, where we're all here to retrieve God's wonderful diversity that's been lost. Lost, for example, in places like Malawi, where Banda, in his 30 years of tenure, tried to make the country a maize exporter. That has resulted in huge hunger situations. A colleague of my generation said, you know, we never had hunger when I was a kid. And I said, why do you think that is now? And he said, people have forgotten about how to grow anything except corn. When I was a kid, we had bananas, we had all kinds of different things, and now no one knows how to grow them. I think about chemicals and how they have been a disaster in many places. I've been in Guatemala, where the farmers are growing the pea pods that people like here in the US in their stores, and the signs on protect yourself from the chemicals are all in English, when no one there speaks English. And so people say, well, we've got the signs up, but they're not helping people. Also, the containers can be wonderful water containers if you can't read the sign, or the size is perfect. And so you think about the health issues that arise from that. I think of things like eucalyptus. Comes from Australia and was introduced as a fast-growing lumber option in so many places. The straight poles are perfect for telephones and electrical lines. But it was really my visit to Australia that made this picture in Cameroon make sense to me. In Australia, a eucalyptus tree has to survive flood, fire, drought, all maybe in the same year. So it's one of the most resilient plants in the world. It also sucks up whatever nutrients it can get. So it sucks up all the water, and it's impossible to do agriculture around it. But it is almost impossible to get rid of, because it can survive any of the things that we would normally do without chemicals. Ours is an ever-changing world with new challenges that require new responses to flourish. I think of the rural to urban shift. More than half of the world's population live in cities, and Martin, those rooftop gardens are getting ever more important. I think about war. By 2030, almost half of the world's poor will live in countries affected by fragility, conflict, and violence. So what do people do? They leave. And migration and remittances that go back home are some of the most effective assistance in the world. In 2014, the amount of remittances sent to families was 3 times the amount of global development. For that reason, governments sometimes encourage it because it helps make up the largest portion of their GDP. But it's no longer just south to north. It's becoming south to south as people escape war. More and more, it's women that go to migrate, and that leaves their children more effective, are more vulnerable to care by others. The other thing that we see are faith shifts. In 1900, 80% of Christians were white. In 2000, 80% are non-white. And so Christians finally look more like the world we serve, where only 12% of the world is Caucasian. But less than a third of the Christians are in Europe and North America, and that's based on self-professed numbers. It's probably even less if we look at active membership. And a positive out of that is that we are beginning to look at how do we help people have the spiritual and social positive transformation that we've been talking about this week in many places. The negative piece is that fundamentalism forces, and we've seen that here. And even Hindus and Buddhists are becoming more militant. But this is our development world we've not entered before, and this is our Father's world. And so as we enter a world that we've not seen before, Todd Bolsinger, in his book, Canoeing the Mountains, compares ministry today to that of Lewis and Clark, who set out as river experts to find the way to the Pacific. And suddenly, they hit the Rocky Mountains. And Todd Bolsinger says that's what we've hit in our world today with the changes that I've just talked about. We are coming into an era that we've never before been equipped to deal with. And so we need to have new skills. So we don't need people like managers to help us do more of what we've always done, but we need leaders who can help us learn and adapt to the new challenges that we'll face. And we need to start those out with reality. And I'm a real believer in pilot projects, like we've heard from everyone else, that don't go for everything big, but look at trial and error and learning what you can. And what's so important is relationships. A program never changed anyone, but relationships do. And so as we look at incarnational transformation is how I think that we need to face the future. And that means that Christ became flesh for us. And so how do we become flesh for others? How do we serve them? Christ gave us our gifts not to have power over, but to serve others. And so we can do that in prayer. We can do that in praise. We can do that out of transforming our own pain. And we can do that by witnessing to what we've seen and heard. We can't change anyone, but we can share what we've seen and heard. And in doing that, I just want to close with this quote by a poet, E. Cummings. We've heard about questions this week. And always the most beautiful answer to who asks a more beautiful question. So may you leave knowing that you can go and ask beautiful questions that help people learn more about themselves and who they are and living in dignity in God's world. Thank you.